Alive and Well STL is a presentation of the St. Louis Regional Health Commission and RareGem Productions to build a healthier St. Louis. Power up with the positive. Learn more at oneraregem.com. That's ONERAREGEM.com.
Support for Alive and Well STL comes from Beyond Housing, helps entire communities become better places to live. Learn more at beyondhousing.org.
The Regional Health Commission works in partnership with regional health sector advocates and stakeholders to improve healthcare access, reduce health disparities, and improve health outcomes for the uninsured and the underinsured in St. Louis City and County.
Alive and Well STL with Bethany Johnson-Javois, CEO of the St. Louis Integrated Health Network.
As we embarked on this journey of Alive and Well STL, we became aware of a very important study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. This study, called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE for short, identified a very strong link between harmful experiences during childhood and chronic disease.
We know that there's a number of factors that can impact how a kid responds to trauma, such as age, developmental level, the type of trauma, the duration of the trauma. And we know that there's a number of factors that can be protective. So in other words, factors that can make it easier for them to bounce back after a traumatic experience. So that can include having a really strong family support. That includes having a caregiver who's really supportive and reassuring and accepting of the child. We know that how adults respond to a child's trauma very much impacts then how the child is going to respond. So we know that if an adult looks at a traumatic event as something that's completely unmanageable, the child will never recover. We know that the child's going to absorb that belief themselves too.
These negative experiences were found to increase the likelihood of substance abuse, of mental health disorders, as well as heart disease and diabetes. And listeners, the ACE study is foundational work, so please know this term, ACE study, and learn more about the results. We'll be right back. What's your definition of being alive and well for children?
I'm going to speak as a parent as opposed to a professional, because that's probably the most passion I could speak with. And what I would want for my children is for them to find joy in life, for them to have support, for them to have meaningful relationships, to feel safe in the world that encircles them, to feel emboldened to explore the world beyond what is known and familiar to them, and to have opportunities to pursue their interests, whatever they may be. Those are some things just off the top of my head.
I think that's a great definition.
Alive and Well STL.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am Bethany Johnson-Javois, CEO of the St. Louis Integrated Health Network and host of Alive and Well STL, sponsored by the St. Louis Regional Health Commission. Today, we are joined in the studio by Nancy Spargo, CEO and co-founder of the St. Louis Center for Family Development, and Emily Phillips, mental health professional for the St. Louis Center for Family Development. As we talk and think about what it means for our community to be alive and well, I'm really excited to be speaking with both of you today, so thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
As we embarked on this journey of Alive and Well STL, we became aware of a very important study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente, a health plan in Southern California. This study, called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE for short, identified a very strong link between harmful experiences during childhood and chronic disease. So that connection was really brought out in that study. These negative experiences were found to increase the likelihood of substance abuse, of mental health disorders, as well as heart disease and diabetes. And listeners, the ACE study is foundational work, so please know this term, ACE study, and learn more about the results. Nancy and Emily, both of you have worked in mental health services for a long time here in our community, helping people, especially children, overcoming the trauma and toxic stress that often leads to poor health. But to begin, Nancy, I wanted to ask you if you could paint a picture for us of the kinds of stressors or trauma that can happen in childhood that has an effect on our health as adults.
So it's very easy to focus on all the negative impacts that trauma might have on an individual, as well as a family, for that matter. And I want to start out just by saying that trauma, while not desirable and certainly impactful, is not something that has to be viewed solely from a negative perspective. And given the pervasiveness of trauma you just cited one reference as 7 out of 10. Given the pervasiveness of trauma, we have to understand that there are a lot of us walking around with a history of trauma that are highly functional and have been able to put the pieces back together and to overcome whatever impact that is. So I want to put that out there right off the bat, especially for parents. When you find out that your child has some kind of traumatic experience, it can be really scary and you can feel overwhelmed very, very easily and think that this is something that will change their life forever. And while it might change their life forever, it doesn't mean that it has to be all bad.
So Emily, why do you think the stressors that happen in people's lives or those traumatic experiences can impact some people differently or more than others? What's the reasons behind that?
You know, it's interesting. We don't actually know exactly why some people will go on to develop PTSD after trauma and some don't. We know that there's a number of factors that can impact how a kid responds to trauma, such as age, developmental level, the type of trauma, the duration of the trauma. And we know that there's a number of factors that can be protective. So in other words, factors that can make it easier for them to bounce back after a traumatic experience. So that can include having a really strong family support. That includes having a caregiver who's really supportive and reassuring and accepting of the child. We know that how adults respond to a child's trauma very much impacts then how the child is going to respond. So we know that if an adult looks at a traumatic event as something that's completely unmanageable, the child will never recover. We know that the child's going to absorb that belief themselves too. And there's also some things that, can be risk factors. So in other words, things that can make it harder for a kid to bounce back after trauma. And that can include, a lack of resources. That can include poverty if they've had previous traumas before, other mental health diagnoses, and, factors like that.
One of the things that I've learned in talking to so many people now at this point is to think about trauma as actually becoming more normalized in our conversation and in our lives, that it's something that in your everyday experience can happen, that it's not place-based or time-based or necessarily one event. And so even I find myself reframing what I think about that and how I think about trauma. And as I hear you both talk, I'm reminded that this information and how we're talking about this is important to everyone, not just a specific segment of our population. But today we're really talking about children. So I wanted to ask, there's a statistic out, I'm not sure if it's related to kids, but research shows that 70% of us have experienced at least one traumatic event in our lives. Now, I interpreted it one way, but I'd like to hear your reaction to it. It means to me that 7 out of 10 people in my church pews have at least one experience. And I'm not even sure they're sharing it with me, and I sit near them every week. In the grocery store, I think about people standing in line. There's 10 people in line. There could be 7 of those 10 in the checkout that have experienced something. Or the bookstore, or at a club. People have had really painful experiences. And many times when I talk to people as an MSW, they talk about the core being from when they were a kid. And all of a sudden they go back to being that child. You can hear the voice and it sounds like a young person again. So what's your reaction based on the work that you're doing? Is that true, or how should we be looking at that? That's a lot of people. It's not half. It's over half. It's people that you don't
More
even...
than 2/3.
Yeah. It's your family reunion. It's your family. It's like 3 people, the guy that's cooking and maybe one more person that's not in that category. I want the audience to kind of think about how prevalent, because life happens, that it is.
I would respond to that by saying that 7 out of 10 is what has been identified.
Yeah.
And in reality, the number might be even higher, depending upon how you define trauma. It is a pervasive issue. And again, there's a continuum as well in terms of the impact of the response that individuals and families and communities have, right? So you can define trauma in such a way as it can be a minor car accident, something pretty mundane, right? And that is upsetting. It shakes you up, right? So that could be traumatic. Somebody might develop post-traumatic stress disorder from a minor car accident, depending upon the rest of the circumstances in their life, kind of like what Emily was saying, given the other circumstances. The vast majority would not. right? The vast majority would be able to recover and put that behind them in a relatively short period of time and would not go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And then again, you have combat soldiers returning to this country. You have people living in violent communities, living with violence in their home, assault, all kinds of things that could have a much more severe impact on an individual, family, or community. And so I think that overall trauma is something that is still an issue that people are trying to embrace. And a lot of people don't understand what trauma is. And a lot of people don't want to deal with the fact that trauma is so pervasive. And yet, if we understand trauma and we understand that it is far more common than what we would want, I think that gives us the power to actually make a difference for the individuals who are having those experiences.
So give us, the listener, our community, some coaching on better understanding this. So what are some, we can either frame it two different ways. We can say do's or don'ts, or I prefer, because I like to facilitate, stop, start, continue. As adults, what are some behaviors that we need to be more aware of so that we are respectful, that we are supportive of children who that we don't even know, may or may not have experienced something? What should we be doing or not doing or start doing? That would be helpful.
Okay, I have two main points about that. The first is that oftentimes when a child experiences trauma, they start to view the world as an unsafe place, or that adults cannot be trusted, or that males cannot be trusted, depending on their own traumatic experience. And it's up to adults and their family and caregivers to help kids kind of relearn that the world can be safe, that adults can be trusted. And that sounds really hard, and it can be very hard. But there are some ways that, adults can make a child feel more secure. And that can be simple things like having a really structured daily routine, having really predictable consequences to behaviors. And a big one is, paying attention to how much contact the child has with the adult who abused them or the adult that caused their trauma. And that's a big one. So it really comes down to that main idea of how do we make kids feel more secure and feel safe again. And then another big piece for adults, I think, is, a lot of the families that I work with, the parent also has their own trauma history. And that really impacts their parenting, and it definitely is going to impact how they respond to their kid, most likely. And so it's really important that adults take care of themselves as well and do some self-checking and pay attention to if this is triggering some of their own history. So I would say those are some of the two big things. Adults taking care of themselves so they can better take care of kids. And then also, how do we keep a kid feeling safe and accepted?
One of the reactions I've heard from parents is, oh, my child's just extra sensitive. Speak to that parent, because I hear it a lot as a way to say, well, it's just kind of their demeanor to be withdrawn, quiet, not trusting of adults, not engaging. They're just sensitive.
Right. So what the child hears with that is that the child has been dismissed. And it's totally unintentional that a parent would ever want his or her child to feel dismissed, right? We have some issues in understanding and being able to, what I would call, translate kids' behaviors. For example, this is one of my concerns and a pet peeve, is that if we understand what a normative response is to a traumatic experience, then we can respond in such a way to actually put that person on the path to recovery and healing very quickly. But if we aren't able to embrace the fact that something's wrong, if we aren't understanding of what a normal response to a traumatic event is, then that's when we draw conclusions that are not as helpful and can actually end up being punitive and discourage the child from opening up. One of my pet peeves is that professionals who might not understand a normative response to trauma misunderstands a child's behavior. And we end up with children getting diagnosed with really serious mental health disorders and medicated accordingly. And the child doesn't have that disorder, nor does that child need to be medicated. And so the message that child gets is that there's something wrong with me. So it's really important, not just for the parents, but for the professionals to really understand what happens when somebody gets traumatized. How does that change behaviors? How does that change how somebody relates to the world, how somebody understands people, how somebody feels about him or herself? And children don't have the language. They don't have the vocabulary and the means to communicate like adults. And so they communicate through their behaviors. So if you have a child who is extra sensitive, to use your example, a child who's going to cry easily, or a child who's clingy, or a child who's fearful, or a child who's jumpy, any of those things, those are all normative responses to trauma. Every single one of those. And if we look at that as the child has a problem or the child is bad, that, I think as adults, we feel a lot of responsibility to guide our children, and it starts with us feeling like we have to be the authority and we have to discipline children, as opposed to looking at those behaviors as a means of communicating something's wrong, communicating I need something different. For me, it really starts with, how do you understand your child's presentation? Or how do you understand the child? If you're a professional or you're a provider, medical provider, childcare provider, it doesn't matter. How do you understand what the child is communicating to you, and how are you going to respond based upon that?
What would you say to listeners who are trying to find the right way to engage? So instead of being punitive or disciplinarian, what types of open-ended questions can parents or caregivers ask that begins the conversation in a healthy way, if they're suspecting that maybe there's more to the story than what they know?
There's one thing that we talk about as providers quite a bit that is just so simple and I think really concrete. Instead of asking a person what's wrong, which implies some kind of disorder, something has to be changed, something's broken. Instead of asking what's wrong, you ask what happened. And just by asking what happened, it takes whatever it is, it takes it out of the domain of that individual person. It's not about that person. It's something that happened externally and impacts upon that person. And so just that little bit of a shift from what's wrong to what happened gives a different message.
Thank you.
I also would add that parents know their kids, they're experts on their kids. And if a parent is noticing changes in their child's behavior and how they're acting, I think that's a pretty important thing to pay attention to. So maybe they've always been a sensitive kid, but if you're seeing some of these things even bigger than they were before, that's when you start asking those questions. And it's also important to know that by talking about trauma, it's not going to make the kid worse or feel worse. It's not going to make the child develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Having that open conversation is actually really helpful for a child to start that process if they have, obviously experienced trauma.
Do you have any other thoughts about things that people can do today, right now, to begin the path of healing and resilience versus some unhealthy habits that it's time for us to break?
I have a few things, I think, in terms of parents, just that are kind of concrete things that a parent can do that would help a child. One is, and this goes for any parent in my opinion, but one is to recognize the need for control, especially people who have had some kind of interpersonal trauma, but even those who have experienced a natural disaster or a bad accident or a disease, surgery, something like that. Control becomes really important because in the act of the trauma, you've lost control. And so it's only human for us to feel the push to assert ourselves and try to regain that sense of control. So as a parent, you can look at that as kind of a pain in the neck that, your kid has just one way to do things or something like that. But I always give people the example, and so it's bedtime and you tell your child, this is a young child, but you tell your child it's time to go to bed, and the child, of course, doesn't want to go to bed. Most children don't want to go to bed when it's time to go to bed. And so instead of saying you have to go to bed or getting into a power struggle and becoming authoritative, you give them a choice. I can either give you a piggyback ride or you can walk. Which would you like to do? So the choice isn't about whether you're going to go to bed. It's about how do you want to get there. But just by doing little things like that, by giving them choices that you can be comfortable with, teeny tiny little things, it helps them to feel more in control, right? And so addressing issues of control like that. The other thing that I think is really big is trust. So there's been some kind of betrayal or some kind of break in the sense of safety. And so doing things purposely and intentionally to regain trust, making sure that you don't make promises you can't keep, making sure that you follow through on consequences. The predictability that Emily talked about, I think, is super important. But the follow through is really big when it comes to trust. And then acceptance. And a lot of times when people have traumatic experiences, that stigma and that shame kicks in. And it's really easy for somebody to feel like something's wrong. That impacts upon how you relate to the world, how you relate to yourself, much less how you relate to anybody else and the world at large. And so as an adult in a child's life, being able to convey that acceptance of who the child is, maybe not the behavior necessarily, but who the child is, and that just because that child is a person, you're going to accept that child and love that child.
That's a great distinction. The behavior versus the person is not the same.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't always want to condone the behavior, right? Because we all make mistakes. You can separate that out and talk about liking somebody, pointing out personal traits that are favorable, that are desirable, that you appreciate, even if you don't like the behaviors.
Any other steps or actions you're thinking about, Emily?
Well, I would just add for parents that it's okay to ask for help from not only your own support system, so that might be family members, church members, but also from, the mental health professional community of St. Louis. There's a lot of places in St. Louis that are trained to work with children who've been through trauma, including our own organization. It doesn't mean that you're not a good enough parent. Again, it's hard enough to parent a child, but to parent a child with a trauma history is that much harder. And then if you add a parent's own trauma history, that's even harder on top of that. So that would be the one thing I would add as far as what steps people can take is seeking out resources for their child. And that can be in your own community or it can be an outside person as well.
So as we close, this is my favorite part. Social workers do it all the time. We want to think about the strengths of a system and we want to shape things for the positive. So given all of those you've worked with in your career, perhaps even personally, share with us your most favorite story of recovery that really helps us to embody the concept or theme of Alive and Well.
It's so hard to pick a favorite. My most recent experience of recovery, because there are so many. But the most recent one was really special because I did individual therapy with a 14-year-old girl who had been sexually abused by a family member. And at the same time, her mom had trauma therapy with a colleague in the same office. So the mom and my client were both receiving trauma therapy. And the changes that we saw in both of them as individuals were amazing. And then for their relationship was incredible as well. It really brought them closer together. It strengthened the child's trust for mom. It made mom a lot better at being a stronger parent, setting some boundaries and things like that. And so the most special part about it was when the mom shared with me that she thanked me for having her daughter go from a child who had this trauma history with all these behaviors and problems at school and problems at home and in the street to just a normal 14-year-old. And that's exactly what my goal is for these kids to go back to some type of normalcy. It'll always be a part of their history, but for them just to kind of just be a normal teenager, that was really special.
Like Emily, I don't know that I can pick a favorite, but a story that I can share about a client that I thought was just a really important illustration is we were working with a 6-year-old boy, and we knew that he had been traumatized. He, too, had been sexually abused. And there was a single mom, and she had 3 kids. I assume she still has 3 kids. There were 2 younger children and then the 6-year-old. And the 6-year-old was having a lot of difficulty sleeping. He was wetting the bed. He was aggressive with his siblings. He was clingy. He was causing her a lot of hardship because she wasn't sleeping at night. It made it difficult for her during the day, and she was more irritable, like anybody would be when we don't sleep. And when we started serving them, it didn't take too long before we discovered that the person who had sexually abused the little boy continued to live across the street. And nobody had stopped to think about what that would mean to him. And he didn't trust that this person wasn't going to be able to get him, quote unquote, again. And he didn't trust that he wasn't going to run into him. He didn't feel safe. Long story short, he did not feel safe. And in that case, it really did take something so concrete as literally moving. Once we realized how much of an impact that was to have that person living across the street, it became clear to the mom that she needed to change her living arrangement. And once, it took a little while, I'm not going to say it happened overnight, but once they had gotten settled into new housing and he started calming down, then we could deal with the behaviors and we could deal with his lack of trust and feeling unsafe. And, so the aggression decreased significantly. He was able to sleep better. He was able to separate from his mom a whole lot more effectively. Mom was that much better of a parent because she was getting sleep and because she wasn't so worried and stressed out. And sometimes it's just really simple things that can make a huge difference in a person's life. And that was a life-changing thing for him and his family.
First, I want to thank you for sharing just such a wealth of information and positioning this in a way that, for me, instills some hope and some expectation of hope that is to come in the future. Is there anything else that you want to add that our listeners need to know before we close?
I can offer a couple things, I guess. One is that as providers, we are people first, and so understanding and accepting that trauma really is a pretty common experience and that a lot of people are able to rise above whatever the impact of that traumatic experience is and to go on, and whether it is to help other people or become CEOs or judges, whatever it is, that it doesn't have to be something negative and that it can actually help us learn that much more about ourselves and relationships when we have to overcome those things. And the importance of being open and non-judgmental. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who are really quick to blame parents for a child's behaviors, really, really quick, and are incredibly judgmental, and whether it be of the child or of the parent. And I think it's really important that we be that much more open and that we understand that the behaviors are nothing more than a way to communicate.
Thank you. Emily and Nancy, thank you again for joining us. And thank you to the listening audience for joining us again for another episode of Alive and Well STL. We look so forward to talking again next week. For more information about today's program and to become involved in Alive and Well STL, download the smartphone application Bonfire, BONFYRE, and search for Alive and Well, or visit us online at aliveandwellstl.com. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening. We are grateful for your gift of time to this conversation. We encourage you to stay involved and get involved. Visit aliveandwellstl.com to learn more.
You are invited to join the conversation. If you, your family, or your organization is interested in talking about how we better the well-being of the region, sign up for more information, join the conversation, log on to aliveandwellstl.com, and let's build a plan on how we can work together and improve our overall health and become alive and well. The Regional Health Commission, with Chief Executive Officer Robert Friend Jr., committed to providing a detailed review of change over the past decade in 14 leading health indicators for the city and county of St. Louis. The first decade review of health status report, an update to building a healthier St. Louis. Discover the narrative, the data, and celebrate the progress already made to improve healthcare access and reduce health disparities in our region. Learn more at stlrhc.org. Alive and Well STL is another positive production of RareGem Productions. Thanks for listening.